Welcome back, guests. Good to see you, Mike.
Great to see you, Kate.
Jeff, we have no Jeff this week?
Jeff's on walkabout.
Oh.
It's a bit mysterious. We're not exactly sure which jurisdiction he is in right now.
He does range far. He does.
But he has his intellectual pursuits and cultural pursuits, and they lead him places.
He is a Renaissance man, our Jeff Meggs.
He will come back fully rejuvenated and reinvigorated for the busy fall session to come.
Excellent. Looking forward to seeing him again. All right. And in a few minutes, we'll introduce our guest. He's waiting in the hotel lounge. I'll just presage our strategy suite later, where Mike and I will be joined by the ever-present Richard Zussman from Global News. We're going to discuss the landmark Cowichan decision in BC Supreme Court, the latest fundraising results for the major parties, what Brad West is up to, and we have a clipping of the week that captures the essence of summer in BC. But first, we're pleased to welcome Wawmeesh Hamilton, an award-winning Indigenous Affairs reporter with CBC Vancouver. He reports on Indigenous people, communities, and issues in BC and across Canada. His work about Indigenous people and reconciliation has also been published on the CBC The National, CBC Radio, CBC Online, and CBC Indigenous. His radio documentary, Not Alone, won the 2020 Jack Webster Award for Best Feature in Enterprise Reporting. And Wawmeesh is a graduate of the UBC Graduate School of Journalism. He lives with his family in Vancouver and is a member of the Hupatchisiut First Nation in Port Alberni, BC. Welcome to Hotel Pacifico, Wawmeesh.
Thank you for having me on.
How was Kate's pronunciation of your First Nation? So good.
Thanks. It's good. Mike likes to pick on me for that, so thanks for. I'm glad I've escaped today. Can I talk a little bit just about journalism? I want to start there. Because I'm also a former journalist, or I'm a former journalist, you're a current journalist. One of the things that I think has changed since I was in journalism, because I've been out for a while now, is I think this recognition that we need to bring more nuance to some of our discussions and our coverage. And I want to share a bit of a story about something that has changed for me, Wawmeesh, about what I saw that I covered when I was a young journalist, which was a story about Sean Brandt, who'd actually led the CN Rail blockades back in the early aughts, I think. And a very long story short is I wrote about how he'd been imprisoned after an altercation with some local white men near Tyendinaga. And I wrote it as a kind of, there's two versions of the story, who knows what's true. And I think underserved the fact that Sean Brandt was in prison and the other gentlemen weren't. And I share that as maybe a tipping off point to say, having you on today makes me keen to talk more about what you see and how we're evolving and how we cover Indigenous issues in journalism and how we can do better. Do you see it getting better? Yeah.
I see it starting to get better. Think of this as kindergarten to grade 12. We're in grade 1 now. You have to remember that a lot of this spawns from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission call to action specifically aimed at CBC and APTN to not only tell more stories about Indigenous people, communities, and issues, but to teach people, non-Indigenous people in our audience, something about Indigenous people they didn't know. Some fact that they weren't aware of. They learned that this is how they see Indigenous people. This is how they're beginning to learn about them. So in that respect, the call to action was dropped in 2015. So that's 10 years ago. It's 10 years old. Let's look at it in the context of a child. This is a 10-year-old child that we're talking about. 10-year-old child in school, just learning, getting better. We're not talking about a child prodigy here. There's more to do. There's more to go. This is the beginning of the journey. The boat's left the dock. The journey started.
Mm-hmm.
And no one told us it was going to be an easy one or a fast one. The journey's going to take as long as it has, as long as it will. And I say that because this is the first time the country has been through this. This is the first time we've encountered this. It's a first. There's no playbook on how to do this. There's no wise old man in the corner giving us advice. Right now, in this life and in this lifetime, there's just us.
Mm.
So we're off and we're learning, but this isn't the end, and we're not close to the end.
Are there conversations happening now where you see signs of improvement or progress?
The very fact that media is far more interested. I'll back up a second. The fact that Indigenous people, communities, and issues have climbed so far up the political and um, media agendas and subsequently created a need for stories, for information about Indigenous people, communities, and issues for the audience. And that need's increased, and it's a lot more than it was 20 years ago, pre-reconciliation, pardon me, pre-Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for instance. It says a lot. The fact that journalism schools now are creating courses specifically aimed at teaching journalists at the beginning of their careers in university how to report in Indigenous communities, how to report about Indigenous people. That speaks volumes, as well as media outlets trying to make space and time for basic stories about Indigenous people and the complex issues we're involved with, and the fact that we're plugged into so many different things that makes reporting about Indigenous people hard not to do, if not impossible.
What was your motivation for getting into journalism? Because you got into a little bit later,
Later,
right? Yeah.
yeah, this starts. I'm going to take about 5 minutes of your time here, and I'm sorry.
It's all
Um,
good.
That's what we're here for.
I lost my father when I was 6, and of the very few memories I have of him are of watching him read, and he read voraciously. He'd sit and read books. He was a subscriber to Life magazine, to National Geographic magazine. He read national newspapers and local newspapers, regional newspapers. He'd read them page to page. He knew what was going on in the world. He knew what was going on in the country, and he knew what was going on in our small town that I grew up in. That was sort of like my introduction to how stories could hold people and interest them. I often think that he wanted to be a journalist himself, although he never said such. But residential school made sure that he didn't do any further than think about that. Fast forward, out of the subjects I was good at in school, of the few subjects I was good at in school, I'll rephrase that, creative writing was one of them. But no one took particular notice of my ability in that area until I went to Vancouver Community College at King Edward campus in 1985, in January, the campus on Broadway. It was an instructor named Betty Pletcher who was tough. She was just iron tough. She'd worked in a newspaper she was in her 60s then. This is in 85, so her newspaper career must have been like in the 50s when there weren't that many women in the business.
Mm-hmm.
And she was just made out of iron. She wore pantsuits. Her hair was like, and glasses were like Marcy and Charlie Brown. But she was tough. And she summoned me to her office one day after class. She said, "I want to speak to you." So I went to her office and she looked at me point blank. I said, "What are you going to do with your life? What are you going to do with school?" And she was very matter of fact and very serious. And I said, "I don't know. I know if I want to do anything with my life, I have to better my education first at the base. That's why I'm getting my upgrading here." She said, what are your hopes, aspirations, dream? What do you dream about doing?" I said, well, I'd like to help my people one day and maybe get a business degree. And I didn't say any more than that. And she looked like she bit into a lemon. She was like, and I stopped talking and she said, it's your life and you do with it what you want. But I guarantee if you try to pursue a business degree, you will be miserable for the rest of your life. You're a storyteller. You're a writer. Do something with those. Don't waste your life. Don't waste that talent. It's yours. You should do something with it. She was the first person in my life that saw my ability, that saw that I had a rough talent at this, and encouraged it. Uh, if you can call that encouragement, it was. It was hardcore encouragement.
Mm.
I didn't do anything with that for a long time. Did some other things, one of which was working at then United Nations.
Yeah.
I raised this because I became an executive assistant to then Vice President and President Ernie Cray. And as his assistant, I would screen people before they came to see him. Among those people were Suzanne Fournier, the Indigenous Affairs reporter with the province, and Terry Glavin, who was then the Indigenous Affairs reporter with the Vancouver Sun. And they would sit and they would interview Ernie for half an hour, then talk and shoot the breeze for a bit and leave. And the next day or the day after, because we got the paper delivered every morning, you would see the stories that they came up with. And I was amazed.
Guess a while back, I was in an airport looking for in-flight reading when a giant kangaroo with a moose head and antlers carrying a tiny briefcase caught my eye. It was on the cover of the latest issue of The Economist for a story about Ozanada, which is a working moniker for Australia and Canada, whose economies, the story noted, are remarkably similar and jointly bigger than India's. The biggest thing we have in common? A challenge with productivity and competition. The good news? The federal government is taking important steps to address those exact challenges in the Canadian economy. Powerful proof came earlier this month when Ottawa upheld the CRTC's decision to require large telecoms to wholesale their fiber networks to competitors at regulated rates. At the same time, the federal and BC governments are committing over $77 million to connect more than 6,900 rural and Indigenous households to fiber to the premises internet, plus $7 million for mobile services to another 727 homes and 120 kilometers of rural roads. The CRTC decision ensures that as we build more and more fiber network infrastructure, every Canadian benefits from real competition and choice, not just the provider who laid the cable. Which is great for TELUS, who are always building Canada, recognizing that enhanced connectivity can spur local businesses, attract new investments, and create job opportunities in rural and Indigenous communities. Ensuring equitable access to high-speed internet helps bridge the digital divide and supports education and healthcare services. This is vital for remote learning, telehealth, and other essential services, particularly in underserved areas. And modern fiber networks are energy efficient and can support smart technologies that contribute to environmental sustainability, which just makes a lot of sense for TELUS and for Canadians. At least, it makes a lot more sense than a giant kangaroo with a moose head and antlers carrying a tiny briefcase.
Just on that, Wawmeesh, like, whenever that was, 1990, 91, around then, each paper having their own Indigenous Affairs reporter at that time.
They
With
were
a separate beat, right?
Yes, they were the exceptions.
And they both wrote books, right? They both wrote
did.
books on topics related to their coverage.
Yes, Suzanne wrote a very extensive book it's a bit dated now, but it's still a centerpiece, a touchstone on the residential school issue. And that was called Stolen from Our Embrace.
Terry's got a Substack, and he's busy writing and he's written books as well on the Gitxsan and other things. Yeah.
Yes. Fast forward, I got married, I had children. My wife and I moved to the island, and I worked a series of jobs. 1997, I decided once more that if I was going to do anything with my life, it had to start with school. That I really had to make a go of it this time, where I was going to be stuck where I was. And I was in a place in life where I wasn't satisfied to be. So I went back to school. I went to North Island College at Port Alberni. I did my upgrading, and then I did my first year of university studies there. Then I transferred to Vancouver Island University in Nanaimo to finish out my 4 years. And I decided that I was going to do a degree in philosophy. That was my plan A. I liked philosophy. I wanted to finish it there, get a master's degree at UBC, and go back and teach philosophy at BIU. That's what I initially wanted to do. But in the first term of my third year, there was a course that I wanted that I couldn't get into. It was too full. And the only one available at the same time was an introduction to journalism, taught by then instructor Richard Dunstan, who'd been an editor of a small paper in Nanaimo for, I think, a decade and a half. So I took it. And I went to class, and from that first lecture, if you know what it's like to play with a kaleidoscope, you know, it's blurry, and you turn it some more and it's sharp and clear. That's what that lecture did to me. I said to myself, this is what I'm going to do with my life. I want to be a journalist. I'm going to be a journalist. This is what I'm going to do. The philosophy plan, out the window. I made every lecture, never fell behind in my readings. The following year, my final year, I took the last 3 offerings in journalism that they had. And then I talked to him being the instructor, Richard, and I said, how do reporters become reporters? Where do they come from? How do they do this? And he said, they come from lots of different walks of life, all over. But all of the ones who've been through my newsroom, he said, it's been a while now. But of all of the ones who went through my newsroom, most of them came from Langara. So I looked up Langara. They had a 1-year program and a 2-year program. The 1-year program was for mature students. I was 40, going on 41 then, or students who had degrees. I shot the dice. I sent an application, and I got my letter of acceptance back in April. And I talked to my family that this is what I want to do. And I moved to Vancouver in September. I was alone. My family stayed at home in Alberni. I lived in a little basement suite on Oak Street, and every morning I was first to the campus. I was first in the classroom. And I was the last to leave at night at 10:30. And I'd go home. I sopped in everything. I never fell behind in my readings. Yeah, I wasn't the top dog there during that time. There were 5 other students who showed more talent at that time than I did. But I'm willing to say that nobody tried harder than me. I tried, and I tried hard. And I graduated. I wrote about one Indigenous issue while I was there. That involved the Indigenous Students Union at that time, who had a room and a president of their association that a group displaced. They displaced her. It was unceremonious, and there was some dirty pool there. And I said so. And I said part of the reason I was writing this was because I thought that because the room was given to them to use by the Students Union, that they were funded with Students Union money, that the student body and the school's executive deserved to know what was happening. And 2 things happened. One, some of the people I interviewed for that story didn't speak to me again. Mm. But 2, at the end of the year, I got an ethics award, a small little bursary for doing that story. If I had to do it again, I would. I tell people this: if I had to do it again, I would. If I had to do it over, I would. Do it the same way I would. I wouldn't change anything. I still stand by that people had a right to know. I worked at Metro, the old commuter paper Metro. That was my first internship job. And I was there from the middle of April 2007 to August 2007. Then I went to the Coquitlam Now until December. They were twice weekly. And I would have covered a maternity leave in January went back to Alberni and put up my feet. Alberni then had a daily, and a daily that was a holdover from its better years.
Pretty amazing that Port Alberni had a daily paper.
Mm.
They also had a brand new weekly.
Yeah.
I went to the AV Times to see if they had the openings, and I got a very abrupt answer, no. So I went to lunch with the editor of Black Press Weekly, Susie Quinn, who had been in the business for 20 years by that point and had slowly risen to editor. She worked across many beats in several different locations. She was a really good photographer, a good editor, and a good reporter. And she said, I have an opening coming up, need a reporter, but look, I can't pay you what the AV Times does. This is what I can pay you. And you'll be the only reporter here. I have the paper to put together. I have my two beats that I do. You'll take a real beating here. But I said, when does the opening start? She said Monday, and it was like Thursday, the previous week. And I just said yes. We had hit it off that well, and Susie doesn't put on airs. Like, what you see is what you get with her. And that was my professional teacher for the next 7.5 years at the
You
AV
worked
News.
in the trenches of community journalism in the Alberni Valley during
Yes, I
that
did.
time,
Yeah.
covering all range of stories, and I can imagine.
City council, regional district, courts, sports, school board, features, breaking news.
At what point did you consider that focusing on Indigenous stories was your path?
In 2013, I took a break. It was a hard grind, being the only reporter. I took a professional break, and I worked for Journalism Human Rights in Toronto. And I covered a series of projects that benefited Indigenous youth. And I went to here in Vancouver, Alberta, Manitoba, Ontario, and I think it was Saskatchewan or the Maritimes. And I covered these projects and wrote about them, took pictures. I saw a few things. I saw a journalism world outside of my small paper in the Alberni Valley. I saw that journalism about Indigenous people, communities, and issues was changing. There was a whirlwind that had started that was creating change in more stories about Indigenous people on TV, on the web, on the radio. You began to hear more, see more, read more about Indigenous people. And I got really curious. I went back to the Alberni Valley News that September. But I tell people, it was like graduating from grade 12 last year and going back to hang around the high school. And that want and need to do more than I was doing, coupled with what I saw changing in the journalism world about Indigenous people, communities, and issues, I had to do more. My editor during that time with Journalism Human Rights was David Beers, who is with the Tyee, but he's also the feature writing instructor at UBC Journalism. And I called him, like I was feeling really restive. And I called him and he said, why don't you come over and tell your story to my students in class? So I did. And when I went to UBC, there's a part of the story no one believes. That's why I don't tell it too often. Are you familiar with where the Rose Garden is at UBC?
Yep.
Yep.
I was standing there and I was looking at the mountains and the water. David came and got me, and we started walking down that small road to the journalism school. And when I looked at the road and I looked around at the surroundings, I swear I'd taken that walk before. It was so familiar. Even in the building, it was all familiar. David, when I talked to him, he said, I lectured to his class and I quite enjoyed doing it. But when I talked to David Beers, he said, have you ever considered doing a master's degree, specifically in journalism? You could up your game by learning some different storytelling skills, like learning how to tell stories on radio, learning how to tell stories on video. Having a master's degree, master's designation after your name could possibly mean more money depending where you work after, if you don't go back into journalism. And you get a bit of a rest from the grind, the daily grind at the paper you're at. And I thought, why not? That intrigued me the same way that first lecture did those years before. And I applied. My family and I got my letter of acceptance. I left my job at the AV News. We packed our belongings and moved to UBC in 2014. And I learned how to tell stories with audio and video. I did my first internship at CBC Manitoba, 2015. And when I came back, there still wasn't a specialization in Indigenous journalism about Indigenous communities and issues yet. But it was coming as a result of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission having gotten off the ground in 2008, I believe. It had across the country, and media had covered the stories that were being unearthed about residential schools across the country. Idle No More was just winding down then. It had gotten really active in 2011. And of course, the missing and murdered Indigenous women's issue had grown into a wave that hadn't even got to the top or crested yet. And it was still rolling.
Concurrent with this career arc you're on, Wawmeesh is just the increasing role that First Nation governments are having, long overdue in in the economy and in other aspects of Canadian society. After having been marginalized for so long, and you told me once that on a visit to the Nisga'a-lisms assembly, that you had, in just the short time you were there, jotted down like 30 story ideas that would have made good news stories if there was a regular reporter covering the beat, right?
Yes.
In the context of, like, I don't know, 180, 200 First Nation governments in BC, that's a lot of turf to cover. So what is your prescription for how journalism intersects with First Nation issues in First Nation communities today? Like, how to bring that transparency to what is increasingly important growing communities?
Let's talk about innovation, because it's more than just a buzzword. At its core, innovation means turning new ideas into real-world value for customers, communities, and the planet. So what does that look like in the energy world? That's where our sponsor FortisBC comes in. With over 2,700 employees living and working across the province, FortisBC is putting real dollars into real projects right here at home. Their Clean Growth Innovation Fund just got the green light to keep going through 2027 with $5.5 million a year dedicated to advancing new innovative energy projects. Since 2020, over $20 million has been invested into 65 projects, from turning farm waste into renewable natural gas to cutting-edge hydrogen research at Simon Fraser University. But here's the best part. This fund isn't just for big organizations. Whether you're a university researcher, a startup in its infancy, or part of a nonprofit with a bold idea, you can apply. If your project can help reduce emissions and build a better future for BC, FortisBC wants to hear from you. Learn more at fortisbc.com/cleangrowthfund. That's fortisbc.com/cleangrowthfund. Sometimes the most exciting innovations happening right in our own backyard. Heck, even right here at Hotel Pacifico. FortisBC, energy for a better BC and a better podcast.
It'll be a challenge, no doubt. But having said this, one of the things that intrigued me about the Nisga'a, I wanted to look at what journalism looked like in BC's new treaty communities, those communities that had struck up modern day treaties with the province and with the federal government. Because as part of the treaty, these communities had adopted the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which contains press freedom. Previously, there was some question about whether or not press freedom applied to First Nations. But when adopting the Charter, it definitively applies. But what does that look like in a new community? And I chose Nisga'a because they were the first in BC to adopt a modern day treaty. And it had been in existence by then, I think, for 20 years. So what did it look like? So I went to have a look. Lissam's government was having their legislature session upcoming. That's the legislature covers the political dealings and business of all four nations. So I went to have a look to survey what was going on. And as I found, there was one guy trying to make a go of a publication because he thought it important to inform people about what was going on in the village governments as well as the Lissam's government that was going to impact them or affect them. He didn't have the training, though, as a journalist to really make a go of this. But he believed in the principle. So I went to the legislature. I was there for a week. And much like I would do at city council, I would just make note of a story idea in the notepad I had. And I stopped counting at 35. 35 story ideas. These weren't issues that were going to crack the bell, bring down the administration, this kind of thing. They were the fish and rice, meat and potatoes things that were going on that were going to impact Nisga'a people in the way of policies to do with land, maybe, or businesses they were involved with, taxes, this kind of thing. How much was it going to cost them? How much were they going to pay? How would it impact? It's the stuff that impacted the citizens. And you're just informing them about it because they have a right to know.
Well, a close cousin of those stories that don't get told are those stories that get kind of in the tumble dry of the news cycle. And really, they need a slower, like a kind of beat reporter lens doing a feature coverage, and that the story gets under. I think there's a lot of Indigenous issues that get in the tumble dry, and they need the slower, deeper, more expert treatment. And I'm going to throw out there that maybe an example of that. I'm curious what you think might be the BC Supreme Court decision on the Cowichan Nation's land rights recently. Like, is there a deep breath we could take on that topic? And a kind of feature coverage that that we should be exploring and understanding more deeply than sort of, because right now it's in the churn of, well, this is really scary. This is really complicated. What are the implications of this? When I think there's a slower conversation to have about this.
I agree. I was going to talk about another issue, but having said this, with respect to Cowichan, it's you hit the nail on the head. This is what I do. I take a marathoner's approach to stories. All the stories I cover, the issues I decide to cover, the things I decide to do. Because journalism in the past about Indigenous issues was so bad. And I remember. But if you slow down, take your time, and just be patient, particularly if you're a non-Indigenous journalist, you get to learn something about the people you're covering. By extension, so do your readers. It's a journey. You're taking your audience on a journey with you. You're taking your audience on this cruise, a cruise ship. You're all on a cruise ship, right? And you're going to go to places that you've never been before. You're going to learn things about people in your own backyard that you didn't know. Do you want to rush through that at light speed? Okay, some of you maybe do, but I don't think everybody does. And what are you learning if you do that? This is also, I think, a very important learning exercise. And you don't learn by speed reading. No offense to speed readers, but you want to take your time, you want to digest this, you want to get different perspectives, which you're going to find in the Indigenous community because they're not homogenous. What are those perspectives? How do they play into final decisions? What are the historical roots of this? With respect to Cowichan, there's so many different elements to this, and it's complicated, but I don't think it's impossible to wade through, to begin to understand it, not its implications. Eventually you'll get to that, but to just understand it as a whole. It's a recipe with many different ingredients. Take your time to find out what those ingredients are and how they work. You're right. This is something we need to take time at to understand.
Well, the judge obviously took time, 513 days, 900-page judgment, which just underscores that, this decision didn't come out of thin air. There's such a rich, background on these issues historically. The foundation of this goes back, obviously hundreds of years, but even to key events that took place in the 1870s, I think it was, and then thereafter. So it doesn't lend well to a TikTok. So, and in your career, you have been one of those journalists who've taken the longer burn on these stories. I've seen some of your stories for CBC National on residential or mass graves, or what could have been a mass grave. I think the one in Manitoba that you've shown me before. And, you took your time to tell the story, and it was an uncertain outcome, right? In terms of how that story was going to turn out. Like you were in there as it was unfolding, and then there is no neat, tidy resolution to these things, when you're telling them properly.
Mm-hmm. It was, I think, a year after the news broke in Kamloops about the anomalies that the ground penetrating radar had found. And forensic anthropologists at that time were saying, okay, look, we found disturbances in the ground and anomalies that are consistent with, among other things, the possibility of human remains. A year after the news in Kamloops broke, we were still spinning our wheels about the ground penetrating radar argument. And I thought, we need to get to what's next. And no one was talking about what was coming next. Nobody. And I thought it important to begin to talk about what's next because it was so horrible. It was horrible to think about. It was going to take time to cope with that and sift through that and plan through it. And that what's next involves coming up with human remains. The remains of some child that died in residential school that were going to be unearthed, identified, maybe sent home, maybe kept there. Because it involved children, it's a difficult thing to think about. And I thought that's why people need to start talking, planning. Because remember, residential schools, kids came from everywhere that went to these things, that were taken to these things. So I found a community, when I pitched this story, I found a community that had done this. And that was the Rosebud First Nation in South Dakota. They went to Pennsylvania to repatriate the bodies of 9 of their children, 9, who had died a century before at a residential school in Pennsylvania, and they brought them home. And they buried 6 of them in a cemetery, and the remaining 3 went back to their families of origin, who dealt with them in their traditional way. I thought, why did they do this? Why was it important to them? What impact did this have on the community? What were the differing points of view about doing this? And how were they resolved? How did they play into the final decision to go? What was the impact when those bodies were brought home? What do they think about this now, a year later? And what lessons might they have to pass on to First Nations in Canada who may be doing the same thing at some point? So we went and covered that. And that was one of the stories you probably saw in the National.
Yeah.
And I tell people this. This is something I tell people I lecture to, longtime journalists. The thing I'll never forget about that trip was when the community took us to the cemetery. And we saw the graves of the 6 children who were buried there. And for the rest of my life, for the rest of my days, I'll always remember when I first saw those plots, they were so small. It really hits home that they were just kids. They were just kids. I think the oldest is 14. And I never forgot that.
Well, Wawmeesh, you've told some incredible stories in your career. We appreciate you lending some time today to allow our viewers and listeners to get to know you a little better. I encourage people to check out your body of work. Just Google Wawmeesh Hamilton, CBC. It probably gets the job done. And see some of these long form pieces that you've done and you're continuing to do. And just want to thank you for stopping by Hotel Pacifico today to share some of your journey with us.
You're more than welcome, and thank you very much for having had me on. If I can just reiterate one thing, the thinking of your colleague. I've not met anybody else who said that, who thought that, and who said it. That maybe we need to just gear down and slow down a bit and look at the immensity of this and all the pieces and begin to understand, to walk through, not sprint through. Look around, ask some questions, and understand. Because if we do, then our audience will.
You got
Thank
it.
you, Wawmeesh. All right, we're moving back to the strategy suite where we've got a guest who we have to contain within the walls of this suite because otherwise he's unleashed and he's unstoppable. Welcome back to the strategy suite into Hotel Pacifico, Richard Zussman.
I'm not sure unstoppable is the way most people would describe it, but unleashed for sure is problematic.
You are your own energy source, sir. It is impressive. And I'm glad you're here because we have some housekeeping we have to do here at Hotel.
We have a mess to clean up, actually.
A mess to clean up in the hotel, a trivia mess. Is that right?
Well, we got a couple messes. So the infamous trivia episode on BC Day week with Baldry and McElroy.
It's infamous? Jeez. Oh,
well, I'd like to think so. Richard was my handy assistant in developing these trivia questions. And following the episode, I've had a couple comments sent in. One is from Tom Hawthorne, who's known to many.
An authority.
Is he former journalist? Is he still at Munro's books?
He is. Last I checked, Munro's Books, obviously one of the best bookstores in the country. And Tom, a longtime journalist, known for his obituaries, probably the best obituary writer in the entire country.
So Tom writes that we had it wrong on which party gained the most from election to election. He says the 3 squabbling social credit factions garnered 2% of the vote in 1949 and then took 30% in the final count in 1952. Now, actually, he says the final count. So I actually didn't go back and look at the first count because that was when you had 3 counts in that election. 1952, Kate. We didn't do first past the post in 1952, by the way.
It was on the tip of my tongue. Yeah, okay.
So he's contending we had it wrong. I will give Tom points for at least flagging that. I'm not totally willing to concede that we had it wrong on a technical basis, but I didn't have that one on my radar. So good for Tom. And then another one from Mark Cargelotto from Prince George, I think. He says, we had a question about what premiers and opposition leaders were defeated in their own ridings. And did you know we may have forgotten Herbert Anscombe in 1952
How did
had
you
been
do
the
that?
conservative leader? How did you know we forgot Herbert Anscombe? So
that one I helped you fact check, and so I'll take the blame for that one because I
but
liked that question, and
Oh my
I did
God.
not see that one.
but
When
he
I
has
was
one that's
doing-
going to come right to your door because this is your handpicked question: is what riding has had four
Yeah,
different parties? He says Saanich North because it had BC Liberal, Murray Cole, and Clive Tanner, Gary Holman from the NDP, Adam Olson, Rob Botterill from the Greens, Hugh Curtis, elected as a progressive conservative in 1972, and a Socrat. That's five.
that's pretty
So,
impressive. You and I talked
Wow.
about this one. I've got to look at that one a little bit more closely, but I think there's probably an argument to be made there. But there was something that hung up on that one for me, so I've got to look back at that. But I appreciate the research.
so,
Okay.
yeah. So, Richard, come on.
Yeah, I'm as glad as I am, gentlemen, that we are treating this topic with the urgency it deserves, kicking off the strategy suite with the cleanup on trivia aisle. Okay, sorry. Before I move us along, I'm realizing
We
Mike's
have to deal with Snickers too.
we have to deal with Snickers.
So final cleanup, Richard. Okay. During the federal election, we made predictions based on the closest ridings in each of the four regions that we looked at. And in two of the four regions, you were defeated by a cat.
I'm very well
And
informed.
you only
cat.
beat the cat once. So the cat beat you 2-1.
Oh,
How do
I
you
think
explain this?
one of the problems was I got confused because I didn't read your script notes about the regions that we were going after.
Well,
And
that's it's a
it also,
cat. You lost to a cat.
and what you beat the cat by one?
I beat the cat 3 out of 4.
It's pretty good.
So anyways,
I also
this
told you
is
before that episode that my expertise is not predicting election outcomes.
oh, it just sounds
It's not. It's also not my job.
okay. Well, we
Okay.
finally set the record straight.
Let the
Snickers.
electorate decide who's going to win.
Okay. All right. Let's get on to it.
Can we
The
move
weighty
to
issues here.
Yes, I know. Can we move on to the stuff that our listeners might find less salient and urgent, but
Yeah,
still
something
topical?
Something
just
that
wanna
doesn't
make
matter,
sure
like the
that-
Cowichan decision.
Like the Cowichan decision, just thinking, less significance, less on the tip of tongues of folks. But if we can dig deep into the headlines and resurrect this one, are we ready to move on, gentlemen, to that one?
I just
think
want to
we
know
can.
that if Justin was going to win, if the questions were actually correct, was Justin actually the winner of trivia?
No, but Baldry's going to win the entire time.
Yeah, we give it to Baldry. I'm declaring him the winner. And I'm moving us on.
He didn't lose points for not being able to turn on his camera.
We had
I
created.
probably
Oh,
would
no,
have.
you
I
didn't
probably
tell
would
me
have.
that.
I probably would have deducted
No.
points. I've been a Keith Baldry camera setter upper for a long time, but I was on vacation when you did it, Mike, which was your fatal flaw. Because if I was there, I would have made sure that Keith knew how to set his camera up
I will
properly.
say that the counting of the votes in the trivia episode was done by the same accounting firm that accounts for campaign promises and the cost of campaign promises. So it was very accurate.
All right. Let's take a minute then. Let's move on. I want to talk about this Cowichan decision because I think, especially while we have you on, Richard, I think, and having talk to Wawmeesh about sort of some of how this coverage, really gets sent into a kind of spin cycle and a turn. And with the Cowichan decision, I think we're firmly in that space, right? And maybe you can talk to us a little bit. I mean, let's pause and talk a little bit about the question that's swirling about what the precedent is and the giant legal question that unhatches. Like, what's next with this?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point because you felt that spin cycle hit overdrive really fast following this decision. This was in court for years and years and years. And it is a monumental decision for the Cowichan around the conversation of Indigenous rights and land and title. But very quickly, this turned to a much broader political discussion around the idea of private property rights. And that is clearly what has dominated the conversation cycle. And, I believe that there should be two distinct conversations here. We need to have a fuller conversation around how we deal with the larger issue of land and title, and how Indigenous communities, when they contest questions around land and title, how is that dealt with? Because I think we have seen here the courts are not the most effective place for these discussions. And on top of that, how do we figure out provincial governments and federal governments that negotiate directly with nations to settle these disputes so they don't draw out over years and years and years? Then the other part of this, and the part that is, largely a larger issue that will pertain to most British Columbians, is this issue around land and title. So if the courts are going to make decisions saying, look, Indigenous land rights supersede that of private property owners, fee simple as it's described in legal terms, then it opens up a Pandora's box that we can't put back in, because there will be decisions made that will have impacts on people's property. And does that mean that different cases are looked at differently based on the land base? So the Haida decision in an area where you have very few property owners, is that looked at differently than property rights decisions that are made in Richmond, Vancouver, Victoria, places where you have people that own significant property and companies that are operating significant infrastructure? How are those decisions made? Because it's now going to become contradictory if you apply the rules differently to different places based on how those places have developed. We're going to have some really problematic political questions for leadership to face.
So this decision, from what I understand, was based in part off the precedent of the Silcotin decision of about 2014, which was the first, I think, in Canada to actually grant outright title to a First Nation. But it also answered some questions that hadn't been settled before. I think I heard Jeff Plant say, it's not reasonable to expect that a BC Supreme Court judge is going to settle this issue. It's going to go to the Court of Appeal, as it ought to. There should be more work done on these issues, and I'm sure it will go to the Supreme Court of Canada.
Absolutely.
So the journey on this is years away, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think the Supreme Court of Canada is the best place to make this ultimate decision. I think the challenge before the courts is, and this is what we often run into when we have political challenges that are decided by the courts, how do we remove the political decision making here from the legal decision making? And the Supreme Court of Canada ultimately will establish the precedent here. But I think one of the concerns that's been flagged that I was alluding to there is, how do we apply the law to areas that are vastly different? Mm-hmm. It is one thing to apply the law to what we would describe as remote areas where you would have very limited resource development. It's different to apply that to an area where you're going to have resource development. It is very different to apply that to area where you've had significant building. And again, you lead to really complicated questions about, how do you assess the value of the land? Are we assessing the land value based on the time in which these First Nations were using that land to hunt, to fish, to live, to build their communities? Or are we assessing the values based on 2025, 2030, 2035? Because we full well know the value of a plot of land in Richmond now has a much different value than it did 170 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago. So there's complications there around decision making. We need the Supreme Court of Canada to make an establishment here around the capacity that the courts have to make these decisions, and then allow government to have those very difficult and complicated conversation with each First Nation. I was at the event at Cowichan Tribes. They want their opportunity to sit before the Premier and say, this is what we want recognized for our communities, for our territory. They don't believe they've been afforded that yet. I think that's something that they deserve. I think it's unfortunate. They feel it's unfortunate here that they've been drawn into this larger debate around taking away people's property, because there are political parties out there, the conservatives, scoring points
Yeah.
on this, saying, look, the government is not doing enough to protect your property. I think that puts the Cowichan tribes in a tough spot. I don't
Yeah.
believe they're
Well,
trying to
it's
steal anybody's property,
yeah,
but
Yeah.
they are in the middle here of a long dispute that they have been
yeah.
arguing in courts for a long time.
Real
And
quick,
this is
Mike.
more than
Yeah.
just property. This is fish, and
Exactly. Yeah.
this is port development. This is marine traffic. There's a lot of
Air traffic.
applications to this decision. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. We'll come back to this. I got to move us along because I do want to check in real quick. We've got the second quarter fundraising results for the provincial parties. I'll list out the numbers and you can kick us off, Mike. Tell us what I'm seeing here, because we've got the NDP at 700,000, the BC Conservatives at literally half that, 350,000, and the Greens just behind them at 200K. So what's going on here with what do I make of that Conservative result?
Well, the Conservatives in the first quarter, it was much closer. It was like 800 to 725 NDP versus Conservatives. So the Conservatives had a pretty big fall off here. And perhaps part of that is a focus on leadership review, and that's where the organizational focus is going. But I went back and looked at BC United, BC Liberals in previous years, and say in the second quarter of 2023, Kevin Falcon's BC United raised more than double what the Conservatives raised this quarter. And they weren't doing that great, in 2023. The year before, they raised 668, and that's almost double what the Conservatives did this time. You'd have to go back to after Andrew Wilkinson's resignation, and while they were having a leadership race, they raised 313. That was the last time it was lower. So the Conservatives can't be feeling good about that, and I think part of it is they obviously had this. They almost won, and and I think I've said this before on the pod. Coming out of that '91 election, when the BC Liberals came out of nowhere and almost won the election, but we're set up as the official opposition. It's like, okay, we're here. The polls have us here. We've got all these MLAs, but the infrastructure's not there, and so the Conservatives have not brought the infrastructure along with them at this point. And there's a gap, and it's a troubling gap for them, because they need that infrastructure to get up to where it needs to be to compete. Because it's not going to be shock and awe, win by surprise next time. It's going to be trench warfare for the next few years with the NDP, and they're going to have to be competitive. So Rustad's team are going to have to show everybody that they can build that infrastructure, because if they have another quarter or another 2 quarters of middling results, and it will raise questions about, are people sitting on their hands waiting to see what's going to happen?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Snickers will also remind you there was a federal election during that quarter of fundraising, and I think that likely had an impact on suppressing what Conservatives were able to raise. I think
Snickers would also like to remind you that the NDP didn't seem to be held back by that.
Well, think about what happened to the NDP in the federal election. So the NDP infrastructure imploded, and the federal New Democrats abandoned that party. Provincial New Democrats, who, as you describe, have a much stronger ability to raise money, fired on all cylinders. The Conservatives don't have any of that infrastructure.
Well, let's get real about provincial NDP fundraising too. It's much of it is GR based, right? It's interests that are buying fundraising tickets so they can go and mingle, right?
Yes, yeah,
and that's a huge advantage.
You had very little of that during that quarter because of what was happening with the federal election. I think it also plays this idea of this conservative confusion, right? There were people out there who described themselves as conservative. They were out donating to the provincial party when their intention was to get Pierre Poilievre elected, and that may have been what hurt them. But these numbers could be bordering on disastrous for the Conservatives, as you describe. Like, if you don't have the ability to raise money, you don't have the ability to mount a campaign to articulate to British Columbians why you should govern.
Side note on the Conservatives, I noticed that Dan Davies, former MLA, endorsed Rustad's leadership last week at an event in Fort St. John. So possibly jockeying to be the Conservative candidate next time.
Right.
He ran as an independent against Jordan Keeley. So just an interesting little subplot there.
Yeah.
Love a subplot. Now I'm going to go back to the main plot. Let's talk about Brad West, who's often in the main plot these days. And I'm going to talk about a column via Sand Cooper's The Bureau. I won't read from it. Maybe I'll just try and summarize it, talking about BC's economy not having value adds like manufacturing, technology, and innovation, and really being built on what he calls a Ponzi scheme, which is the real estate market. Richard, can you help us understand maybe why Brad West feels like he needs to get this off his chest right now?
Yeah, I think Brad is attempting to position himself as a populist centrist, which is a place that is complicated in politics to find yourself. There haven't been a lot of people who have successfully done that. You know, you need to know about Brad, his history, working through the New Democrats, being part of a union, and then becoming a very high profile suburban mayor in Metro Vancouver, but he has found himself in a place where he gets the most engagement online when he weighs in on some of these populist issues. Some of his most successful posts are around this issue about China's influence on British Columbia, around government's challenges about facing that. He is positioning himself around the area of affordability. He's correct in his assertion that this government and other governments before it have relied very heavily on the housing market through property transfer taxes to strengthen our economy. We can't rely on that as much anymore. And I wonder what is in Brad's political future here. He hasn't been shy about this idea that provincial politics may be what comes next. I will be very curious to see what he does around a decision
For
about
what
whether
party?
he's running
Yeah.
again for mayor. And
Yeah.
and I think the party piece is interesting. And I've spent a lot of time talking to Brad, and I don't want to break any of those confidences and conversations I've had with Brad about what future looks like. But it is not, you would be blind not to see that Brad wants to position himself as a disruptor. And where that exists in our political system is challenging. We did a story on Global when there was a serious movement about whether he was the leader that could unite BC United and the Conservatives. And I spoke to Brad after that story, and he received feedback from thousands and thousands of British Columbians who had all sorts of things to say about this idea of him entering this space as a disruptor. And I think he's trying to find a way to position himself, saying, look, I'm trying to get through the noise of red tape and bureaucracy and wokeness, as some would describe it, and find places where we can be disruptive. And it's a hard place to find in politics, but I think this op-ed,
I've got a label for him.
Trying to position it. Okay, I can't wait to hear it.
Let's hear it.
He's a socialist Socrat.
What?
Sure. Yeah.
He's a socialist Socrat.
He's a socialist Socrat.
Yeah.
A populist New Democrat. They're rare. This breed is rare. And it will be curious to see what he does, because he has skills in a modern political era to communicate with an electorate when it's getting harder and harder to communicate with the electorate. But he has a young family, and and he's mentioned this as well. His family has faced some tough times this summer, and I think this. Both of you know this. Living through politics, the personal toll it takes on you is intense, and I think Brad is grappling through that. At the same time, you can tell by pieces like this, he has a lot he wants to put on the table for British Columbians to discuss about how we could be our best selves, how BC can be the best it can be as a province. And I think he has some tough decisions to make over the next little bit around the toll that this next journey could take on his family.
Let's move along. I want to just take a quick moment and talk about our clipping of the week. Our clipping comes from Justine Hunter, writing in the Globe and Mail about a hike into history. It's a fascinating story on the creation of Strathcona Park on Vancouver Island, and retraces a hike led by BC's Land Commissioner Price Ellison and his then 20-year-old daughter, Mira, as they reach the top of Crown Mountain. I'm not going to have time to read from it. Justine is a beautiful writer.
Yeah.
I just need to say that. Mike, can you tell us a little bit?
Yeah, I just think we're throwing this in as a summertime flag for people that Justine did a great job writing about the creation of Strathcona Park. It's a great reminder of one of the great defining traits of British Columbia is these amazing parks we have. Raises a question of like, do our politicians spend enough time, frankly, milking or mining from this rich vein of identity that we have in these parks? And I encourage everyone to check out Justine's piece in the Globe from early August, A Hike into History, to just enjoy her writing and kind of reflect on that in these waning days of summer.
That's nice. All right, let's grab a drink. Mike, can you kick us off this week? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to take a shot at politicians who, when they win on election night, as Pierre Poilievre did last night, I'd like to thank the great people of ... It's just like, I want to hear a politician who says, I want to thank the average,
the mediocre
people of my riding who elected me here. Can we have that just once? But more seriously,
I
do want to raise a glass to someone who passed away, Mark Curtin, former Vancouver Canuck, actually, but more importantly, an advocate for action on ALS. He died of ALS. He was a real crusader. He worked with this is the group that Don Wright is the chair of nationwide, ALS Action Canada. My sister, who passed from ALS, was involved with this group. Had a chance to work with Mark Curtin briefly, and a lot of these advocates, patient advocates, they know they have ALS, and they give of themselves selflessly to make it better for the next generation of people who are going to have ALS. So I want to honor the contribution Mark Curtin made for making everyone else's life better.
Hear, hear. All right, Richard.
I am going to raise my glass to my son, Eli. He is 9 years old, and he is about to finish off his hair growing journey, and he is going to donate his hair to Wigs for Kids.
Wow,
Yes.
Wigs for Kids is an amazing, amazing organization in this province. It does two things. It encourages people to grow out their hair. Mike, I wish you and I could contribute, but we can find other ways to help out. And you can donate that hair, and they make wigs for kids with cancer who need them. On top of it, they also raise money to support families who are going through this cancer journey. Our daughter Bailey did this twice. Eli saw that a few years ago and said, I want to grow my hair out as well. He actually grew it out much longer than expected because he fell in love with long hair. But after getting it caught in a few too many zippers and having a few too many fights about brushing his hair, he decided now is the time. So he'll cut his hair next week. We are raising money for Wigs for Kids through their website. So you can go check that out as well. But my glass is raised to him as he's a very conscious kid and very caring, and doing his best to support kids with cancer in this province.
Fantastic.
That's fantastic. Way to go, Eli. And to Bailey, too, for her contributions. That's awesome. That's awesome. I'll just double down real quick and say, Mike McDonald, you're not allowed to respond to this. My glass is raised to Snickers. I'm going to call Snickers the winner of the election pool. And you're not allowed to add to that. That's just the cat one. That's the nerds. There we go. All right. I want to thank Wawmeesh Hamilton and Richard Zussman for checking in today. And I want to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS and Fortis BC. We will see you next week, guests. BC, you can never leave.